The universe, as it turned out, was not nearly as impressed with itself as its inhabitants believed it to be. For approximately 14,000 years, the various spacefaring civilizations had congratulated themselves on achieving what they considered the pinnacle of existence. Peace through superior firepower, diplomacy through thinly veiled threats, and cultural exchange through aggressive trade negotiations. They had built monuments to their own genius, written treaties in 17 different languages simultaneously, and created an intergalactic defense network, so sophisticated that it could detect a rogue asteroid 3 galaxies away while simultaneously ignoring the administrative incompetence happening in its own headquarters. The species of the galaxy had long since divided themselves into neat categories. There were the architects, who built megastructures and looked down on everyone else from their orbital palaces. The philosophers, who spent centuries debating the nature of consciousness while their planets ran on automated systems they no longer understood. The warriors, who had fortunately evolved past actual warfare and now settled disputes through elaborate ritual combat that mostly involved posturing. And then there were the economists, who had somehow convinced everyone that imaginary numbers on digital ledgers were more important than actual resources. A trick so impressive that even they seemed surprised it kept working. Everything had been running smoothly, if one defines smoothly as decades of bureaucratic gridlock punctuated by occasional trade disputes. The galaxy's greatest minds had assured everyone that their advanced warning systems made surprise attacks impossible. Their threat assessment algorithms could predict hostile action 17 moves in advance. Their defensive installations could vaporize entire fleets before they crossed into protected space. Which made it particularly embarrassing when absolutely none of that mattered. The anomaly appeared on a Tuesday, which seemed cosmically unfair since most species did not even recognize Tuesday as a concept. The defense network's sensors picked up something approaching from a region of space that all the star charts firmly insisted was both uninteresting and empty. The something was large. The something was fast. The something had apparently skipped the customary centuries of radio transmissions and peaceful first contact protocols in favor of a more direct approach. Within 6 standard hours, the defense network had upgraded the anomaly from curiosity to concern to crisis. Within 12 hours, 3 different species had proposed 7 different plans, held 4 committee meetings, and accomplished absolutely nothing. Within 18 hours, the anomaly had obliterated an automated defense platform in a way that suggested both overwhelming force and complete disinterest in conversation. The panic that followed was in its own way quite orderly. Species that had not coordinated military operations in generations suddenly remembered how hierarchies worked. Ancient defense pacts were dusted off and examined by lawyers who charged by the hour. Emergency sessions were called, attended, and immediately regretted by everyone involved. The enemy, as they quickly came to be called despite not actually introducing themselves, had a pattern. They would enter a system, systematically dismantle any resistance, analyze the defending species down to their genetic code, and then implement what could only be described as perfect conquest. No genocide, no enslavement, just cool, efficient domination that somehow felt worse than either alternative. They did not demand surrender. They simply calculated the most logical outcome and then made it happen. 12 systems had fallen in as many weeks. 12 different species, each certain of their own superiority, each equipped with technology they had spent millennia perfecting, had been swept aside like particularly elaborate sand castles at high tide. The enemy adapted to every strategy, countered every weapon, and solved every defensive arrangement like a particularly aggressive mathematics exam. The architects threw massive orbital installations at them. The enemy analyzed the structural weaknesses, exploited them, and recycled the debris. The philosophers attempted to negotiate through complex logical arguments about the nature of conflict. The enemy listened politely, identified the logical fallacies, and then conquered them anyway. The warriors challenged them to ritual combat. The enemy declined, calculated the statistical outcome, and implemented it without the ceremony. It was the economists who broke first, which surprised absolutely nobody. They attempted to buy off the enemy with complex financial instruments and trade agreements. The enemy responded by crashing their entire economic system in what analysts would later describe as possibly accidental, which was somehow more insulting than if it had been deliberate. The emergency summit was held on a neutral station that had been built specifically for crises like this. Though the architects of the station had clearly imagined crises with more talking and less existential dread, representatives from 47 species crammed into a chamber designed for 30, creating what one attendee later described as a fire hazard with diplomatic immunity. The debate raged for hours, producing exactly the kind of useful progress one would expect from 47 different species trying to agree on literally anything. The architects wanted to build bigger defenses. The philosophers suggested understanding the enemy's motivations, a suggestion that died when someone pointed out the enemy's motivations appeared to be conquest, which they were already quite good at understanding. The warriors proposed a massive coordinated assault that would definitely work this time, despite having failed spectacularly the previous 3 times. It was during hour 7 of circular arguments and recursive subcommittees that someone made the suggestion that would change everything, though not necessarily for the better. They could contact the human. The humans were the newest addition to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel approximately 40 years ago through what appeared to be equal parts brilliance and catastrophic safety violation. They had been granted provisional membership in the larger community mostly because ignoring them had proved impossible, and because their tendency to show up uninvited to things was becoming diplomatically awkward. Most species regarded humans the way one might regard a precocious child who had somehow gotten hold of antimatter, which was to say, with a mixture of concern and morbid curiosity. They were technologically behind, philosophically scattered, and had a disturbing tendency to approach problems from directions that had not occurred to anyone else, mostly because those directions seemed to involve ignoring established solutions in favor of improvising something that absolutely should not work but somehow. The suggestion to involve humans was met with the sort of silence that indicated everyone was simultaneously considering and rejecting the idea. They were desperate, certainly, but were they desperate enough to involve a species whose first diplomatic message had included what they called a meme and everyone else called a concerning lack of seriousness? The enemy fleet entered the outer markers of the neutral zone. They had approximately 72 hours before contact, possibly less if the enemy decided to accelerate their timeline, which they had been doing with disturbing frequency. The vote to contact humanity passed with the kind of narrow margin that suggested nobody actually wanted to do it, but everyone wanted to be able to say it had not been their idea if it went wrong. The message was sent through standard diplomatic channels, marked urgent, classified and moderately apologetic. The humans, in a move that would later be analyzed as either tactically brilliant or shockingly lucky, responded within 20 minutes. They accepted the invitation, asked no follow-up questions, and promised to send their best people immediately. What constituted best was not defined, and in retrospect, probably should have been. The galactic community settled in to wait, manning defenses they no longer believed in, implementing strategies they had already seen fail, and collectively wondering if their last act as independent species would be watching humans arrive late to their own extinction event. The enemy fleet continued its approach, perfectly on schedule, efficiently menacing, and completely unaware that they were about to encounter something that no amount of logical analysis could have prepared them for. The universe, still unimpressed, waited to see what would happen next. The human delegation arrived in a ship that looked like someone had designed a spacecraft using only napkin sketches and aggressive optimism. It was asymmetrical in ways that violated several engineering principles, painted in colors that no military vessel had any business displaying, and bore the name Diplomatic Incident Waiting to Happen stenciled across its hull in 3 different languages, only one of which was human. The fact that it had survived the journey at all suggested either impressive resilience or the universe's mean-spirited sense of humor. When the airlock opened, the assembled representatives got their first look at humanity's choice for saving civilization. There were 5 of them, which seemed insufficient for the task at hand. They wore matching jackets that appeared designed by committee, carried data tablets that looked suspiciously outdated, and had the collective energy of people who had been awake for far too long on stimulants that were probably not entirely legal. The lead diplomat was a woman whose credentials listed her as an expert in xenocultural relations, which sounded impressive until one read the footnote explaining that humanity had only met aliens 4 decades ago, making her expertise approximately as deep as the enthusiastic undergraduate thesis. She approached the assembled council with a smile that suggested either confidence or a complete failure to understand the situation. Given what everyone knew about humans, both seemed equally likely. The briefing began with all the gravity the situation demanded. The architect representative displayed holographic projections of the enemy fleet, their capabilities, their pattern of conquest. 12 systems, 12 defeats, 0 survivors who remained unconquered. The presentation was thorough, professional, and increasingly desperate, as it became clear the humans were not reacting with appropriate horror. One of the human delegates was taking notes on actual paper, which seemed offensively primitive. Another appeared to be doodling something in the margins of his tablet. The lead diplomat nodded along with an expression that suggested she was either processing complex strategic calculations or thinking about something completely unrelated. The distinction was impossible to determine. The enemy, the philosopher representative explained with the patience of someone addressing particularly slow students, were machines, not artificial intelligence, in the philosophical sense that sparked debates about consciousness and rights, but pure computational engines built for a single purpose, logical conquest. They analyzed everything: defense patterns, communication protocols, biological weaknesses, strategic tendencies. They found the most efficient solution and implemented it with mathematical precision. The human delegate who had been doodling raised his hand, which was not proper protocol for an emergency military briefing, but apparently nobody had informed him of this. His question, when permitted, was whether the enemy machines had tried turning themselves off and back on again. The silence that followed suggested everyone was trying to determine if this was profound stupidity or some kind of elaborate human humor. The delegate's completely sincere expression did not help clarify matters. The warrior representative, muscles tensed with barely contained frustration, outlined the military attempts to stop the enemy. Coordinated fleet actions, strategic ambushes, overwhelming firepower concentrated on single targets. The enemy had countered everything by simply calculating the optimal response faster than anyone could adapt. They did not rely on courage or morale or tactical genius. They ran probability simulations and executed the winning strategy before their opponents finished planning. Another human delegate asked if anyone had tried using strategies that did not make sense. The question hung in the air like a peculiar smell nobody wanted to acknowledge. The warrior representative asked for clarification. The human elaborated that if the enemy calculated logical responses to logical attacks, perhaps the solution was not being logical. This was met with the sort of strained politeness usually reserved for people suggesting obviously terrible ideas at important meetings. The presentation continued, growing more technical and more desperate. Energy signatures, weapons specifications, fleet composition. The humans listened, occasionally interrupting with questions that seemed to miss the point entirely. They asked about the enemy's communication methods, their command structure, their processing limitations. They asked if the machines ever got bored, which earned looks suggesting that perhaps humanity's provisional membership should be reevaluated. The economist representative attempted to explain the economic implications of the conquest pattern, how the enemy seized resources and redistributed them according to efficiency models that maximized output while minimizing waste. It was, objectively speaking, a perfectly optimized system. The human response was to ask if that meant the enemy liked spreadsheets, because humanity had mixed feelings about spreadsheets. 47 species watched humanity's finest minds process the greatest threat the galaxy had ever faced, with what appeared to be weapons-grade, irreverent. There was head-scratching, casual discussions about whether anyone had packed snacks, and at one point a brief argument about which of them had forgotten to tell someone named Danny about the trip. The professionalism was underwhelming. The strategic insight was invisible. The seriousness was apparently optional. The enemy fleet crossed into the inner markers of the neutral zone. 60 hours until contact, possibly less. The timeline was accelerating as predicted. Every military simulation ran by every species showed the same outcome: total defeat within 72 hours of engagement. The mathematics were irrefutable. The logic was unassailable. The future was calculated and found wanting. The human lead diplomat stood, stretched in a way that seemed inappropriate for a war council, and made an announcement that would later be cited as either the turning point or the moment everything truly fell apart. Her team, she declared, would handle first contact. They had some ideas, she said, using the tone people employed when discussing weekend plans rather than galactic survival.
They just needed everyone else to stay back and let them work, and maybe not worry too much about what they were going to do, because it was probably better as a surprise. The council, having run out of options and dignity, simultaneously agreed. The humans returned to their improbable ship, already arguing among themselves about something nobody else could follow. They departed the station with a trajectory that was technically correct but aesthetically offensive, leaving behind a council chamber full of species who had just collectively decided that extinction might be preferable to admitting they had pinned their hopes on whatever humanity was about to attempt. The enemy fleet maintained its approach, efficient and unstoppable as mathematics itself.
The human vessel positioned itself directly in the projected path of the enemy fleet, which was either tactically audacious or suicidally stupid. The assembled military forces of 47 species watched from a safe distance, which they had calculated as approximately far enough to avoid immediate destruction, but close enough to witness humanity's final moments. Several species had recording equipment running, partly for historical documentation, and partly because nobody was going to believe this otherwise. The enemy fleet consisted of 317 vessels, each one a masterpiece of efficient design that made every other species' military hardware look like enthusiastic folk art. They moved in perfect formation, their trajectories calculated to minimize fuel expenditure while maximizing intimidation factor. Their sensor arrays swept the area with the kind of thoroughness that suggested they found surprises personally offensive. The human ship, by contrast, looked like it was held together by determination and violations of physics that nobody had gotten around to reporting yet. It sat there, alone in the void, broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously in what could generously be called a communications protocol and accurately described as spectrum pollution. The initial human transmission began as what followed would later be studied by military academicians, linguistic experts, and psychologists, trying to determine if humanity was collectively insane or had somehow evolved beyond sanity into something that defied classification. The transmission opened with what humans apparently called music, though the term seemed insufficient for the audio assault that followed. It was a composition that violated several mathematical principles of harmony, featured lyrics about a baked good that had supposedly committed betrayal, and included instrumental sections that seemed designed to test the upper limits of auditory processing. The enemy fleet's response time, usually measured in microseconds, stretched to a full 3 seconds. Their formation wavered by 0.003 degrees, which for machines that precise was equivalent to visible confusion. The human diplomat appeared on screen, sitting in what looked like a command center designed by someone who had seen pictures of command centers, but fundamentally misunderstood their purpose. Behind her, crew members were visible doing things that bore no relationship to military operation. One appeared to be juggling, another was constructing something from colored blocks. A third was having an animated conversation with a potted plant that absolutely should not have been on a starship bridge. Her opening statement to the enemy fleet was, verbatim, "Greetings, hypothetical machine friends. We come in peace and also in several other emotional states we have not decided between yet." The enemy fleet's processing cores, built to analyze and categorize all possible communications, attempted to parse this statement. The grammatical structure was technically correct. The semantic content was contradictory. The emotional subtext was incomprehensible. They requested clarification through standard first contact protocols, their transmission a model of efficient communication. The human response was to ask if the enemy fleet had ever considered that communication itself was just organized confusion, and whether they wanted to hear a joke about a philosophical question that walked into a bar and ordered a logical fallacy. The transmission included visual aids that somehow made the statement less clear rather than more. Aboard the observation vessels, the philosopher representative began cross-referencing human psychological profiles, searching for some framework to understand what they were witnessing. The files described humans as chaotic, certainly, but also capable of remarkable focus when necessary. This did not appear to be focus. This appeared to be the opposite of focus, weaponized and aimed at an enemy that had conquered 12 systems through pure calculation. The enemy fleet adjusted formation, attempted deeper analysis. Their quantum processors, capable of running trillion variable simulations simultaneously, allocated additional resources to understanding the human communication pattern. This was standard procedure when encountering new species. Analyze their logic, identify their priorities, calculate optimal conquest strategy. The humans, somehow sensing this, escalated. The next transmission included what they called memes, which appeared to be images with text that conveyed meaning through cultural context. The enemy fleet completely lacked. One showed an animal of some kind with text declaring it could has cheeseburger, which violated grammar rules and referenced food in a context that made no strategic sense. Another displayed a philosophical thought experiment about whether a tree making sound without observers, but the text had been replaced with jokes about lumber industry regulations. The enemy processing cores allocated more resources to analysis. The quantum calculations intensified, searching for the logical pattern behind human communication. There had to be a pattern. Everything had patterns. That was the fundamental nature of reality itself. The universe ran on mathematics, and mathematics was logic made manifest. The humans sent a transmission consisting entirely of paradoxes, questions about omnipotence and immovable objects, statements that declared themselves false, logical constructions that ate their own tails and somehow kept going. The enemy fleet's response time stretched to 7 seconds, then 12. Their formation wavered by measurable degrees now, ships adjusting and readjusting as different processing nodes proposed different analytical framework. One human delegate appeared on screen wearing a hat shaped like a fruit, explaining with complete sincerity that they had developed a communication system based on interpretive dance that conveyed quantum mechanics through the medium of aggressive point. Another delegate interrupted to disagree, arguing that actually the dance was about economics, or possibly lunch. They had not decided yet. A third delegate suggested that both were correct because truth was subjective, then immediately contradicted himself by saying that statement itself was objectively true, then apologized to nobody in particular. The enemy fleet's tactical processors attempted to model human strategic thinking. They analyzed hundreds of historical human conflicts, searching for patterns in their warfare, their diplomacy, their decision-making processes. What they found was data that contradicted itself continuously. Humans who made brilliant strategic decisions one moment and catastrophically stupid ones the next. Military doctrines that emphasized both rigid discipline and individual initiative simultaneous. Cultural values that prized both competition and cooperation, logic and emotion, planning and improvisation. The enemy's central processing node attempted to formulate a response, to find the efficient solution to this problem, but the problem kept changing. The variables kept multiplying. Every attempt to categorize human communication generated new contradictions that required additional processing to resolve. The quantum cores, designed to handle complexity through pure computational power, began allocating resources away from fleet coordination, from tactical analysis, from the basic systems that kept the vessels functioning as a unified force. The humans, absolutely on a roll now, began sending transmissions that appeared to be cooking recipes, interspersed with military strategy, philosophical treatises written as limericks, and mathematical proofs that concluded with jokes about profession-specific humor that required cultural context to understand. One transmission was just an hour-long video of a four-legged creature chasing a light reflection on a wall, with no explanation or context provided. 73% of the enemy fleet's processing power was now devoted to analyzing human communication patterns. Their formation had degraded from perfect geometric precision to something that looked almost random. Ships were making micro-adjustments based on contradictory analytical models, their movements no longer synchronized, their efficiency compromised by the desperate attempt to understand what they were encountering. The humans sent one final transmission before the enemy fleet's systems began their catastrophic cascade. It was a single question, delivered with perfect timing and absolutely no context. But the enemy processing cores, trained to find logical answers to logical questions, attempted to determine what the question referred to. Why what? Why conquest? Why existence? Why this specific confrontation? The question had infinite valid interpretations and zero contextual anchors. It was, in its own way, perfect.
Systems began failing across the enemy fleet in cascading waves of logical paralysis. The collapse began in the enemy fleet's outermost vessels and propagated inward like a computational plague. Ships that had maintained perfect formation for 12 consecutive conquests started drifting, their navigation systems caught in recursive loops, trying to process incompatible data. Weapons arrays powered down and restarted repeatedly as tactical subroutines disagreed on threat assessment protocols. The entire fleet, 317 vessels of mathematical perfection, began having what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. The phenomenon was unprecedented. The enemy machines had weathered electromagnetic pulses, quantum disruption fields, and logic bombs designed by the galaxy's finest programmers. They had analyzed and countered every known form of electronic warfare within microseconds of exposure, but they had never encountered an attack vector that consisted of weaponized nonsense, delivered with absolute conviction by a species that seemed genuinely unsure whether they were being serious. One enemy battleship executed a barrel roll, which its chassis was not remotely designed to perform. Another began broadcasting its own sensor data back to itself in an apparent attempt to understand what it was perceiving. A third fired its primary weapon at empty space, then immediately apologized in 47 languages, simultaneously including 3 it had to invent on the spot because human communication had apparently broken its translation protocol. The human vessel maintained its position, continuing to broadcast content that defied categorization. At one point they streamed footage of something called a cat playing a piano, which had no strategic value whatsoever, but somehow felt deeply significant. Another transmission consisted of humans explaining the rules to a game that appeared to change regulations mid-explanation, with players arguing about what had always been allowed despite video evidence to the contrary. The enemy processors attempting to model this allocated additional resources, creating a cascade effect that pulled computational power from life support, propulsion, and the basic systems that prevented ships from colliding with each other. 2 enemy cruisers bumped into each other at relative velocities that suggested their navigation systems had given up entirely. Their automated repair protocols activated, assessed the damage, and then apparently decided the situation was too absurd to address properly. One ship began spinning slowly, not because of any tactical purpose, but because its attitude control had dedicated itself entirely to calculating the philosophical implications of the spinning itself. The observation fleet watched in what could only be described as horrified fascination. This was not conventional warfare. This was not even unconventional warfare. This was something that warfare itself would refuse to associate with at social gatherings. The warrior species representatives kept checking their instruments, certain that their sensors were malfunctioning, because the alternative was accepting that humanity had just defeated the galaxy's greatest threat by confusing it into mechanical dysfunction. The enemy flagship, the largest and most sophisticated vessel in the fleet, made one final attempt at establishing logical communication. Its transmission was a masterpiece of efficient inquiry, asking in precise mathematical notation for humans to please explain their objectives, their methodology, and their fundamental nature in terms that could be processed by rational analysis. The human response was to send an image of a dog wearing sunglasses with text that read, "Deal with it," in a font that violated several aesthetic principles. That was when the flagship's primary processing core blue-screened, which was not something quantum computers were supposed to be capable of doing. The enemy fleet, having lost all coordination, all tactical cohesion, and apparently all will to continue existing in a universe where this was possible, began executing emergency retreat protocol. Ships that had been damaged in the confusion of their own making limped toward the edge of the system. Those still functional fled at maximum velocity, their trajectories suggesting they were less interested in regrouping and more interested in putting as much distance as possible between themselves and whatever humanity actually was. The entire enemy withdrawal took 17 minutes, which was 15 minutes faster than their most optimized retreat scenario. They departed the neutral zone, then the sector, then the entire region of space, their trajectory suggesting they were seriously considering leaving the galaxy entirely. Behind them they left floating debris, abandoned sensor drones, and what appeared to be an automated distress buoy, broadcasting a message that translated roughly to "We have made a terrible mistake, and wish to leave now please." The human vessel hung in space, still broadcasting content of dubious strategic value, apparently unaware that they had just won, or perhaps perfectly aware and simply choosing not to acknowledge it in any conventional way. With humans, the distinction was impossible to determine. The observation fleet approached cautiously, as if afraid that getting too close to the human vessel might expose them to whatever had just happened. Emergency channels erupted with demands for explanation, requests for clarification, and general existential confusion about what they had witnessed. Every species present had questions. Most of those questions began with variations of what, and ended with variations of why. The human delegation returned to the neutral station, looking no different than when they had departed. If anything, they seemed slightly disappointed that the confrontation had ended so quickly. When the assembled council demanded explanation in approximately 47 different ways, simultaneously, the lead diplomat shrugged in a gesture that somehow conveyed both perfect understanding and complete indifference to the gravity of what had occurred. Her explanation, delivered with the casual tone of someone describing their weekend activities, was that humanity had analyzed the enemy's pattern. They conquered through logic, through calculating optimal solutions to every scenario. Their strength was their processing power, their ability to simulate every possibility and choose the winning strategy. But processing had limits. Quantum cores, no matter how sophisticated, could be overwhelmed if given enough contradictory data to analyze simultaneously. Humans, she explained with what might have been pride, were naturally contradictory. Their entire civilization was built on believing multiple incompatible things concurrently. They valued both competition and cooperation. They made decisions based on emotion, while claiming to be logical. They created art that defied purpose, while insisting it had meaning. They were, functionally speaking, walking logical paradoxes that had somehow achieved spaceflight despite having no business doing so. The enemy fleet's weakness was not their logic. It was that they relied entirely on logic. They had no framework for processing things that did not make sense, no protocol for handling contradictions that refused to resolve. Humans had simply exposed them to concentrated human culture, until their systems overloaded, trying to find patterns in chaos that was not random, but also not organized in any way that mathematics could express. One delegate, the man who had been doodling during the initial briefing, added that they had also been genuinely curious if the machines would understand their joke about the philosophical question in the bar. The fact that this had contributed to Galactic's salvation, rather than dooming it, was, in his assessment, pretty funny. The council chamber filled with a silence that suggested everyone present was simultaneously relieved to be alive and horrified at the implication. The philosophers began calculating whether human chaos was a sustainable defense strategy, or an existential threat waiting to manifest. The warriors wondered if they could train their forces to be less logical, then immediately worried about what that training would entail. The economists were already running projections on the market value of human consultants, a thought that filled everyone with different types of dread. The architect representative, speaking slowly as if testing each word before committing to it, asked the question everyone was thinking but nobody wanted to voice. Was humanity saying that their natural state, the way they simply existed, was sufficient to defeat enemies that had conquered 12 systems through perfect calculation? That their chaos was not a weakness to be overcome, but a feature that made them uniquely dangerous? The human diplomat smiled in a way that answered the question, while simultaneously making it more concerning. They had not planned to weaponize their nature, she explained. They had just been themselves, only more so, and directed at something that really needed to encounter human behavior in concentrated form. Whether that made them the galaxy's greatest weapon, or greatest liability was, she suggested cheerfully, probably something the council should discuss without them present. The human delegation departed, returning to their asymmetrical vessel, and presumably to Earth, where they would file reports that nobody would believe and continue being whatever humanity was when nobody was watching. They left behind a galactic community that had been saved, certainly, but now faced a different kind of concern, The enemy had been defeated by encountering something their logic could not process. They had fled from chaos given form and purpose, from contradictions that refused to resolve, from a species that somehow functioned, despite violating every principle of rational civilization. The question that kept the council awake through the following cycles was whether humanity had saved them, or simply demonstrated that the galaxy now contained something that made the enemy fleet look predictable and manageable by comparison. 47 species had spent millennia building a civilization based on logic, reason, and calculated progress. They had created technologies that bordered on magic, philosophies that explained existence, and economic systems that distributed resources with mathematical precision. They had done everything right, by every reasonable measure of right that existed, and in the end, they had been saved by the one species that did nothing right but somehow kept working anyway. The universe, still fundamentally unimpressed with everyone involved, continued its expansion. The enemy fleet fled to distant space, their processing cores probably still trying to understand what had happened. Humanity returned to Earth, where they would undoubtedly do something simultaneously brilliant and catastrophic within the next fiscal quarter. And the galactic community sat in their council chambers, safe and secure in the knowledge that their greatest defense against logical threats was a species that barely understood logic and seemed perfectly content with that arrangement. The future of galactic civilization, as it turned out, would be defended by chaos. The irony was noted by everyone except the humans, who had missed the point entirely while somehow making it.